The CEO sat down for what was supposed to be just another interview. And then she saw the man behind the desk, and everything inside her went still, because 20 years ago, in the middle of a storm that should have killed her, that same man had pulled her from a sinking car and vanished before she ever learned his name. The conference room felt smaller than it should have, though it occupied the entire corner of the building's top floor. All glass and steel, and carefully curated minimalism meant to impress donors and visiting executives. But none of that registered to her now as she stepped inside with the controlled confidence that had once defined her entire career. She had walked into rooms like this 1,000 times before, always the one in charge, always the one others waited for. Yet today she carried no title, no assistant trailing behind her, no board expecting results, just a portfolio in her hand and a quiet determination to begin again somewhere that didn't feel like a battlefield. The decision to step away from her role had shocked everyone who knew her, from investors to competitors, but they hadn't understood the exhaustion that had been building beneath her polished exterior, the slow realization that success had become something hollow, something measured in numbers that never quite translated into meaning. This interview, with a modest but respected nonprofit focused on community health initiatives, was supposed to be her reset, her way of finding purpose again in something smaller, more human, more real. She reached the table, offered a polite, professional smile, and extended her hand automatically, her voice steady as she began. "Thank you for meeting with me." But the rest of the sentence never came, because in that exact moment she finally looked up, and the world tilted beneath her feet. The man seated across from her was not what she expected. She had imagined a committee, perhaps a panel of directors, or at least someone with the polished, performative authority she was used to facing. But instead there was just one man, early 40s perhaps, wearing a simple button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled to his forearms, a pen tucked behind one ear like he had forgotten it was there, his posture relaxed but attentive, the kind of presence that didn't demand attention, yet somehow held it anyway. But it wasn't his demeanor that stopped her cold, it was his face, or more precisely, a sudden, overwhelming recognition that struck her with the force of something long buried rising to the surface all at once. Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the table as her breath caught. The practiced composure she had spent years perfecting slipping in a way she couldn't control, because she knew those eyes. Calm, steady, quietly observant. And she knew the shape of that jaw, the faint crease near his brow, the way he seemed to assess the world without judgment yet with a kind of grounded certainty. Time had changed him, of course, softened some edges and deepened others, but it hadn't erased him. And now, sitting just a few feet away, he was no longer a distant memory blurred by years, but a living, breathing reality that made her pulse race. He noticed the shift immediately, his own expression flickering with mild concern as he leaned forward just slightly, professional instinct kicking in as he asked, "Are you all right?" And the simplicity of the question nearly undid her, because it echoed something she hadn't heard in 2 decades yet somehow recognized instantly. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came at first, only a flood of images she had spent years trying not to revisit. The darkness of that night, the relentless pounding of rain against glass, the sickening jolt of metal against metal, the disorienting silence that followed, broken only by the slow, creeping sound of water filling the space around her. She blinked, tried to anchor herself in the present, but the past pressed in harder, demanding to be acknowledged, and before she could stop herself, she heard her own voice, quieter now, uncertain in a way it hadn't been in years, say, "I'm sorry. Have we met before?" The man across from her paused, studying her more carefully now, as if searching his own memory for something that might connect them. But after a moment, he shook his head slightly, not dismissive, just honest. "I don't think so," he said, his tone thoughtful. "But I meet a lot of people here. It's possible." She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, a faint, almost disbelieving laugh escaping her as she tried to reconcile the man in front of her with the memory that refused to stay buried. And then she leaned forward just a fraction, her eyes locked on his as the truth pushed its way out. "Highway 16, she said, the words coming slowly at first, as if testing themselves against reality. "It was raining, really hard, and there was an accident." My car went off the road. She washed his face carefully, searching for any sign of recognition, any flicker that would confirm what she already felt in her bones. And for a moment there was nothing, just polite attention. But then something shifted, subtle, almost imperceptible at first, a tightening around his eyes, a slight tilt of his head, as if a distant echo had finally reached him. Encouraged, she continued, her voice steadier now, but carrying a weight it hadn't had when she walked in. I was trapped, she said. The door wouldn't open. The water was rising. And then, you were there. The room seemed to hold its breath with her as the memory bridged the gap between them. And she saw it then, the exact second it clicked for him, the moment the past aligned with the present and recognition took hold. He leaned back slightly, not in shock, but in quiet realization, his gaze sharpening as he looked at her again. Really looked this time. And no, he didn't say anything immediately. She knew. She knew she hadn't imagined it, hadn't built it into something it wasn't over the years. The man who had once pulled her from the edge of death was sitting across from her now, not as a rescuer in a storm, not as a fleeting figure disappearing into the chaos of sirens and rain, but as a single father, an operations director, a man who had clearly lived an entire life in the space between that night and this moment, while she had built hers on the second chance he gave her without ever knowing who he was. And suddenly, the interview didn't matter anymore. Not the job, not the role, not the carefully planned next chapter she had come here to begin, because everything about this moment felt bigger than that, more significant, as if the past had reached forward to meet the present in a way neither of them could have anticipated. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't thinking about strategy or outcomes or what came next. She was just sitting there, across from the man who had saved her life, realizing that some stories don't end when you think they do. They just wait, quietly, until the moment they're meant to begin again. The storm that night had swallowed the highway whole, the kind of relentless, blinding rain that turned headlights into smears of light and made even the most familiar roads feel dangerous, unpredictable, alive in the worst possible way. And 20 years ago, long before he ever sat behind a desk or worried about school pickups and grocery bills, Owen had been in the middle of a double shift, riding the thin line between exhaustion and instinct as a paramedic who had seen just enough of life's fragility to know that every call mattered, no matter how routine it sounded when it came through the radio. The dispatch had labeled it as a minor accident, a single vehicle off the road along a stretch of Highway 16 known more for speeding tickets than fatalities, and under normal circumstances, it might have been exactly that, something quick, manageable, another box checked before the end of a long night. But the weather had rewritten the rules, turning a simple crash into something far more dangerous, something that didn't announce itself loudly but unfolded quietly, steadily, like a trap waiting to close. By the time Owen and his partner arrived, the scene was already wrong in ways that couldn't be ignored. The car wasn't just off the road. It was angled sharply into a flooded ditch, its rear wheels barely visible above the rising water, its front end crushed against a bent guardrail that looked like it had tried and failed to hold it back. The rain hammered against the windshield as Owen stepped out, his boots hitting water that was already higher than it should have been, and for a split second, he took in the full picture, the current moving faster than expected, the way the car shifted slightly with each surge, the faint flicker of interior lights still glowing through the rain-streaked windows. And he knew immediately that this wasn't a situation that could wait. "We need extraction," his partner called out over the storm, already reaching for the radio, but Owen was already moving, because there was something else, something instinctive that overrode protocol, the unmistakable shape of a person still inside. He waded into the ditch, the cold water pushing hard against his legs, each step deliberate as he fought to keep his balance, his focus narrowing to the car and nothing else, to the possibility, no, the certainty, that someone in there was running out of time. When he reached the driver's side, the door was jammed, the impact having twisted the frame just enough to seal it shut, and inside, through the fogged glass and sheets of rain, he could see her, a young woman, barely conscious, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, strands of wet hair clinging to her face, her breathing shallow and uneven as water seeped steadily into the cabin around her. "Hey," he called out, his voice firm but calm, the way he had been trained. The way he knew mattered even when the person might not fully hear it. "Stay with me, all right? I'm right here." There was no response, not really, just the faintest movement, but it was enough. It meant she was still there. He tried the handle again, harder this time, but it didn't budge, and the water was rising faster now, creeping up past the bottom of the window, turning urgency into something sharper, more immediate. His partner was shouting something from the road, about waiting, about safety, about not risking both of them, but Owen barely registered it, because waiting meant calculating, and calculating meant time, and time was the one thing they didn't have. He stepped back just enough to get leverage, bracing himself against the shifting ground, and drove his shoulder into the door with controlled force. Once, then again, the metal groaning under the strain but holding, stubborn and unyielding. The third time, something gave, a sharp, jarring crack that sent a shudder through the frame, and the door opened just enough to let water rush in faster. A sudden surge that made the car tilt dangerously, as if reminding him how close they were to losing everything in an instant. He didn't hesitate. He reached in, ignoring the freezing water soaking through his sleeves, his hands finding her shoulders, steadying her as he worked to free her from the seatbelt that had locked under tension, his fingers moving quickly, precisely, even as the current pulled harder at both of them. "I've got you," he said, more to anchor himself than anything else, and then the belt released, and suddenly she was weighed in his arms, heavier than she looked, limp but still breathing, still there. Getting out was harder. The water had climbed higher, pushing against him with enough force to make each step a fight, the car shifting again behind him with a low, ominous creak that made it clear it wouldn't stay in place much longer, and for a brief, dangerous moment, he felt his footing slip, the current catching him off guard, threatening to drag them both sideways into something deeper, something he couldn't see. But he adjusted, tightened his grip, forced himself forward one step at a time until the resistance lessened and the ground steadied beneath him. By the time he reached the road, his partner was there, taking her from him, already moving into the practiced rhythm of assessment and stabilization, voices overlapping in clipped, efficient phrases as they worked to keep her breathing, to keep her heart steady, to keep her here. Owen stood back just long enough to catch his breath, rain still pouring down around them, his chest rising and falling as the adrenaline began to ebb, leaving behind that familiar, hollow quiet that came after moments like this, the knowledge that it could have gone the other way, that a few minutes, a few decisions, could have changed everything. They loaded her into the ambulance quickly, the doors slamming shut against the storm, and as they pulled away, sirens cutting through the night, Owen glanced back once, just once, at the car now nearly swallowed by the water, its light finally flickering out as if the moment had closed behind them. At the hospital, the chaos continued. Doctors, nurses, bright lights, the controlled urgency of a system designed to catch people before they fell too far. But Owen's role ended where it always did, at the threshold between rescue and recovery. He gave his report, answered the necessary questions, watched just long enough to see that she was in capable hands, that the fragile thread keeping her here hadn't snapped, and then, without waiting for thanks, without leaving his name or expecting to be remembered, he stepped back into the night and moved on to the next call, because that was the job, because that was what you did when saving lives wasn't a moment, but a responsibility you carried from one emergency to the next. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know what her life would become after that night, and he never imagined that, 2 decades later, the woman he had pulled from rising water would walk into a quiet office, sit across from him, and recognize him before he ever recognized her. The realization didn't come with drama or raised voices or anything that resembled the kind of moment people would expect from a story like this. It settled quietly between them instead, heavy and undeniable, as if both of them understood that what had just resurfaced wasn't something that needed to be performed, only acknowledged, and for a few seconds neither of them spoke, the hum of the building filling the space where words should have been, until she finally exhaled, a slow, steady breath that carried 20 years of unspoken gratitude with it. Her fingers loosening around the portfolio she no longer had any interest in opening. "I've thought about that night more times than I can count," she said, her voice softer now, stripped of the authority she had walked in with, revealing something far more human underneath. Not in a dramatic way, just in the quiet moments. wondering who you were, whether you even remembered. Owen leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression thoughtful rather than overwhelmed, as if he were turning the memory over in his mind, fitting it into place among countless others from a life that had once been defined by emergencies and split-second decisions. I remember the storm, he said after a moment. And the car. I didn't know if you made it, though. We don't usually get that part. There was no bitterness in his tone, just simple truth, and something about that landed harder than she expected, because for her, that night had been everything. A before and after, a line drawn through her life that separated who she had been from who she became. But for him, it had been one of many, important in the moment, but not something he held on to, not something he built his identity around. She nodded slowly, absorbing that, then allowed herself a small, almost incredulous smile. I did more than make it, she said. I rebuilt everything. And whether you meant to or not, you were part of that. His eyes met hers again, steady, curious, not dismissing what she was saying, but not elevating it into something larger than he believed it to be either. And that groundedness, that refusal to see himself as anything extraordinary, only made the weight of what he had done feel more real. She glanced around the office then, taking in details she hadn't noticed before. The organized stacks of files, the calendar marked with handwritten notes, the small drawing pin near the corner of the desk, clearly made by a child, bright colors, and uneven lines forming what looked like a house and two figures holding hands. You have a daughter, she said, more as an observation than a question. Owen followed her gaze, and for the first time since she had walked in, something shifted in his expression, something warmer, softer, the kind of quiet pride that didn't need to be stated outright. Yeah, he said. She's 8. Keeps me busy. There was a pause, but this one felt different, less about the past and more about everything that had happened since, the lives they had each built in the space between that storm and this room. And she found herself thinking about the contrast in a way that felt sharper now. How she had spent years chasing scale, influence, impact measured in metrics and growth charts, while he had stepped away from a career defined by urgency to build something steadier, something centered around being present for one person who depended on him. You left the field, she said, not accusing, just trying to understand. After a while, he replied, it's not the kind of job you can do halfway. And after my wife passed, it didn't make sense to keep living like I wasn't needed anywhere else. The simplicity of that explanation carried more weight than any long justification could have, and she felt it settle somewhere deep, alongside everything else this moment was rearranging for her. She looked down at her portfolio then, at the carefully prepared notes, the outline of a future she had convinced herself she wanted, and for the first time since deciding to come here, it felt misaligned, like something built on an idea that no longer fit who she was becoming. With a quiet, decisive motion, she closed it and set it aside. I don't think I'm here for the job anymore, she said. Owen raised an eyebrow slightly, not surprised exactly, but curious about where she was going with that. No, he asked. She shook her head, a faint smile touching her lips, but there was something steadier behind it now, something that felt more certain than anything she had walked in with. No, she said. I think I came here because something unfinished brought me here. And now that I understand what it is, I can't just sit across from you and pretend this is a normal interview. He let out a small breath that might have been a quiet laugh, leaning forward just enough to rest his forearms on the desk, his attention fully on her now in a way that felt less formal and more equal. So what happens instead, he asked. She held his gaze, the answer forming not as a strategy or a plan, but as something simpler, more direct. Instead, she said, I tell you that the life you helped save didn't just continue. It grew into something that can actually do some good. And I think it's time I used it for that. She hesitated for just a fraction of a second, then added, with people like you. People who do the work without needing recognition. People who show up when it matters. Owen considered that, not rushing to respond, his eyes drifting briefly again to the drawing on his desk before returning to her. And when he spoke, his voice carried the same grounded certainty it always had. If it helps people, he said, then it's worth talking about. There was no grand agreement, no dramatic shift, just that simple opening. But it was enough, because both of them understood that something had already changed in this room, something that didn't need to be forced into a neat conclusion. as she stood to leave, gathering her things but leaving the portfolio behind without even noticing. She paused at the door and looked back at him. Really looked this time, not as the man from a memory or the figure behind a desk, but as the person he had become through years she hadn't witnessed. "I meant what I said," she told him. "You saved my life." Owen met her gaze, calm and steady, and gave a small nod. "Then make it count," he replied. And for the first time in a long time, she knew exactly how she wanted to try.